The next session at Tulika is The World Seen from Asia, Asian Viewpoints in Global History. This session will be hosted by Pierre Singaravélou. The next session at Tulika is Speaking History. And for this session, we have Pierre Singaravélou, Ira Mukhoty, and Manu Pillai in conversation with Jerry Pinto. Pierre Singaravélou is a French global historian who currently serves as a British Academy Global Professor of History at King's College London. He is also Professor of Modern History at Paris Pantheon Sorbonne University and the Director of the Center for Asian History at Sorbonne. Singaravélou specializes in the modern period. Ira Mukhoty is an astute author and historian who pens masterful works of narrative history. She is the author of several critically acclaimed works that put women front and center. Through her works, Ira aims to reclaim the voices of women that were erased from the tapestry of Indian history. Manu Pillai is an acclaimed historian and celebrated author of 5 books. A winner of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar for his first book, The Ivory Throne, he is also a columnist at Min Lounge. Manu holds a PhD in history from King's College London. Jerry Pinto is a well known poet, writer, editor, and translator. For his works, he has received several awards, including the Sahitya Academy Award, the Crossword Prize, the Hindu Lit for Life Award, and the Wyndham Campbell Award for Fiction from Yale, USA, to name a few. He has edited several anthologies and is an acclaimed translator as well. The next session at Tulika is Speaking History. Welcome Pierre Singaravélou, Ira Mukhoty, Manu Pillai, and Jerry Pinto.
As you can see, cameramen rule. So when you have to move right, you have to move right. When you have to move left, you have to move left. And I think that's a very good way to start the question and answer session today about history, which is often, sort of like deeply imbued in positionality, in the sense that what position you take, whether it's a left position, a right position, or a centrist view, often determines not only the discourse that you make, but also in India, very, very powerfully, the response that you get to your writing. So I'd like to start with our guest, Pierre. Does this actually affect your work because in India we have a very polarized intellectual and public sphere. Is this the same for you?
Yes, I must say that I think it's the same in France, because in France the statesman, the political activists, and sometimes citizens consider or used to consider history as a supermarket. History as a supermarket when you can do your shopping. You can select facts. You can invent fake news, and so in fact the one of the main subjects which trigger numerous controversies in France is the Second World War, and the second one is the colonial past. The colonial past induces controversies each month, sometimes each week in France, because the journalists, for instance, used to interpret social issues in post-colonial or in colonial terms. Like for instance, police violences, immigration, economic inequalities, racism. All these issues are often interpreted in post-colonial terms. And moreover, I must say that the main statesmen instrumentalize the colonial past by saying fake news. Or I have just perhaps one or two example of this kind of fake news. The first one is the one of our famous president of the French Republic, Nicolas Sarkozy. Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president of France at the beginning of the 2000s. It was elected in 2007, and Nicolas Sarkozy began his new mandate in 2007 by traveling in Senegal. He went to Senegal and he went to the very famous university in Dakar, which is the Cheikh Anta Diop. Cheikh Anta Diop, this is one of the most famous African intellectual, okay? And behind a lot of Senegalese intellectuals in the audience, like here, you know, and before, you know, he was in front of a lot of Senegalese students as well. He dared to declare, the African man has not entered enough into history. The African man has not entered enough into history. And by saying that, he was simply repeating a cliche, one of the worst stereotypes of the French and the European colonial sciences of the end of the 19th century, because his speechwriter Henri Guénaud, but we don't care, and himself were inspired, and they are still inspired by colonial science, you know. So this is just an example to say that, in fact, the colonial mindset is still very influenced, you know, in the French culture.
Thank you for that. A very interesting example. I mean, Ira, how would you respond to the question?
Thanks for that question, Jerry. And, you know, I haven't really thought of my work in relation to the reactions I've received to them negatively, let us say. And now thinking about it, I think it is the nature of the sort of work I do that the reactions I have, the negative reactions have been largely tempered. I think because a lot of my work does revolve around women in history and bringing them out into center stage. Just to let you know that most people are just surprised and shocked to hear the first thing about women being in history. It is not something that threatens them. They see it as a safe space, something we can talk about quite openly, even though it does challenge enormously a great number of givens that we have in India. So, for example, the book that I had, which perhaps received the most feedback, is Daughters of the Sun, which is a study of the women in the Mughal Empire. Until then, I was told by lay people as well as academics that why are you bothering spending your time researching the women of the Mughal Empire? They really didn't do very much. And the very deep-rooted, noxious idea about Mughal women was the colonial one, you know, that they were sequestered, they were kept within the zanana, almost quasi-prisoners. They did nothing with their time, nothing constructive. They used to fight amongst each other. It was a very toxic environment. And they produced nothing of worth. So what are you going to, you know, where will you find the sources? Of course, as I found, it's a long story. There were a lot of stories. There are a lot of stories to tell. But I received only, I must say, only positive feedback because people do not see it essentially threatening to hear about women. The whole genre of women falls somewhere under that pink zone where people think it is fairly inoffensive to the male point of view. I think the big, we talk a lot about conspiracy these days with the rise of various political parties in the world. But I think the biggest conspiracy is that women haven't contributed to history. That is the biggest lie and conspiracy that we have been told, all of us, whether in the West or in Asia. And it is something that I am trying to bring out. But, to just respond to your question, it doesn't seem to generate the sort of responses that, say, Pierre or Manu may have been, receiving.
Well, I think fundamentally there's a tendency where there are some who will reach a conclusion and then they'll arrange the evidence around the conclusion. And then there's the other approach, which is to be led by the evidence. Even then, I don't think you can ever claim to be fully objective because we are all creatures of society. We are all ultimately conditioned by our own position. So therefore, there is a degree of bias, I suppose, in anything that we do. But the way you do it properly is that your bias is minimized. You're sort of trained to reduce the bias to, say, 5%, as opposed to some people who write with, say, 60% bias, where they've already decided, this is my conclusion, I'm going to find the evidence to support the conclusion, and that's how I'm going to do history. And we've got plenty of examples of that kind of writing, especially now, partly because, we have in power now a government that believes that there was a big leftist conspiracy for many, many years. There was only one perspective that was permitted. And therefore, as a corrective, there must be a more right-leaning perspective, which puzzles me because the answer to say, even assuming that, okay, there was a leftist conspiracy in history, the answer to that isn't to create another skewed version of history. The answer is to just learn to do history better, as reasonably and as even-handedly as possible. Even then, I think living in the world that we do, where we also have social media, we've also got things like that around us, where you may write, in my case just now, I've written a book that's 600 pages long, and then I did a 1-hour interview with somebody for their YouTube channel. They picked out one segment for an Instagram reel, and then people will completely sort of freak out based on that Instagram reel. The example I'll give you is there's one just now on my Instagram, which is on sati, and it simply says that in the 19th century, there was a tendency among missionaries who had come into India to exaggerate the occurrence of sati, because there were lots of parts. It was very dense in Bengal. It didn't exist very much in the Maharashtra area. In South India, it was there to a certain degree. In Kerala, it was non-existent. So the overall picture in India about sati is a lot more vague compared to the figures that we get from colonial Bengal, from white missionaries writing in the 19th century. But what's interesting is there's a whole bunch of people who don't even listen to what you're saying, and they say, oh, you're trying to defend sati. I was like, I'm not defending sati. I'm trying to clarify that perhaps we need to rethink the numbers, we need to rethink the way a cultural phenomenon existed, and understand that even in the criticism that was published in the 19th century, there was a politics. It was linked to colonialism, justifying the white man's rule, and so on and so forth. So it is tricky that way, where the public is involved and where people have opinions. And because history ultimately, while there is an academic way of doing history, history also feeds public ideologies, it also feeds political ideologies, it feeds nationalism. And therefore, history is also an emotional commodity. So a lot of people engage with the past emotionally, and therefore, if you reach a conclusion or a point that doesn't support their emotional position, they think that you are biased or they think you're taking a side. And then, then the actual fact is that if you're a trained historian, your job is to stay above the board and be led by your evidence.
I'd like to, so many things that came up in these three answers. I'm already just flailing but I'd like to take that point that Mr. Sarkozy made about the man who is not represented in history. And of course, what you said is correct. The African not represented in history suggests that there is one history, and that history is the one that I know and was in my textbooks. What is your response to the fact that these days there is a claim that we need many histories, women's histories, the histories of the marginalized, the histories that were told in narrative form before history became, academized, and kind of, there is a set of there's a toolkit. Because before that, history was poetry, history was story, history was legend and myth and everything. So, when you hear about these multiple histories, what does the historian think? Pierre?
Oh, there are a lot of things in your remark, in your question. First of all, I must say that there are two forms of history or historical discourses which prevail nowadays. In France, in Europe, in North America, but I think in India, in Asia as well. The first one is what we call in France, for the francophone, le roman national. This is the national narrative. The national narrative is the prevailing form of storytelling, even for a lot of professional historians. It's a way of telling history focusing exclusively on the nation state. This is what we call in social sciences the methodological nationalism. The methodological nationalism, this is to consider the nation state, France, Germany, India, as the most relevant or even the unique framework to analyze a phenomenon. Obviously, it's not a good way to write history, but this is the most common way. It's not the best way because a lot of phenomenon don't fit in this frame. You know, culture, ideas, social practices, migrations, capitalism don't fit with this frame. But this is, you know, this narrative. This national narrative is the first form. The other form, which prevails, is what we call universal history. The universal history is not global history. It's a very ancient form of history, which dated from the antiquity and the medieval ages in Europe, especially. It is based on a very ancient theory, which is in Latin called Translatio Imperii. Translatio Imperii with two I at the end. It is the idea that you can explain world history as the succession, okay, of various center of civilization, of various great empires, okay, from Greece, of course, at the 5th century before Christ, because this Translatio Imperii, this universal history, is based on the idea that there is always a conjunction between history and geography, between space and time. So the center of the world history at the 5th century before Christ was in Athens, okay? Then it moved to Rome, in Italy. Then it moved to the Byzantine Empire. Then to the Italian medieval cities during, you know, the medieval epoch. Then to the Spanish Golden Age at the 16th century AD. Then to the French Great Age, you know, with Louis XIV. Then with the British, the Victoria era during the 19th century. Then, of course, the American century, and so on. That is why the journalists are talking about the Asian century for the 21st century and perhaps the African century for the 22nd century. Okay, this is the way we understand history. Why is that? Because, in fact, history is chaotic. And people, I mean, even the professional historians need to give meaning, need to give a meaning to these chaotic materials. So we invented this very poor theory. This is a poor theory, and this is a false theory, just because, for instance, if you look at the power, at the most powerful empire, the most powerful empire is not the Spaniard one or the French one during the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th century. It was the Qing Empire in China and the Mughal Empire in China, who represented half of the world wealth at this time. You know? So these two empires had no place. They are totally forgotten in the European textbook, you know, in the secondary school. So you understand that this universal history forgot a lot of countries, a lot of people, a lot of histories.
I was in Oxford recently talking to a bunch of students, white students, who had not heard of the colonial empire in history. Ira.
I'll just pick up on 2 points for that, you know, to say that since I am interested there are two major threads to my work. One is to push back against the colonial narrative, you know, that colors a lot of our history. And the second is to bring out women wherever I can. So where the question of bringing out the evidence for women in history, I am far less privileged than those who are not focusing, you know, specifically on this area, because I don't have the privilege of wading through enormous amounts of primary materials or sources. So I'm not wading knee deep in all kinds of physical evidence that would pass the test of an academic historian, say. For example, when I was writing about, I wanted to write about Amrapali, 6th century BCE Ganika or courtesan of the Republic of Vaishali. Now, there's so little evidence for her. The only evidence that we have is a poem and a little bit of information because she happened to cross the path of one of the most famous men in Indian history, the Buddha. So she ends up, after a lifetime of being a very successful courtesan, she gives up all her jewelry, all her privileges, and follows the Buddha and becomes a monk. And because the Buddhist followers and disciples later on are great record keepers, they keep a record of Amrapali as an example of a fallen woman and how she may be redeemed. So thanks to even that, biased recording, I have her voice because she writes down a poem, as do a number of other, Buddhist nuns in the Therigatha. So this precious document, which is hardly ever referenced, has the voice of women from 2,500 years ago. And how precious a thing is that? So I will not throw away this very scant evidence. Mirabai, similarly, many of her bhajans have not been 100% attributed to her. But am I going to throw away those padas and the sort of emotions that she evokes? Not at all, because I don't have the kind of luxury that, researching, say, on the male bhakta poets would have. So when you're doing this kind of work, you have to look at everything. You do not have the sort of privilege of saying, I'm going to only look at written sources. So I am now, in fact, consciously starting to listen to oral histories as well. I was trained in the West, so I have this revulsion towards oral histories. I feel I should only look at written text and written records. That's what the West teaches us, how to do history, how to do science, how to do academia. But now I need to go beyond that because women's histories are often in the songs, in the poetry, in the oral stories. That is one part. The second part is because I do look at trying to push back at the colonial narrative. So the two often intersect because colonial men often fought over the way in which women were represented. And so we may talk about patriarchal systems everywhere, but there have existed throughout history a number of matriarchal societies, matrilineal societies here in Kerala. Throughout the world, these have existed at different times, and at different periods of time and in different places. It's not that it has been just a similar binary patriarchal existence. So in Awadh, which is one of the places I was talking about, when the British came into Awadh to try and take it over in the late 18th century, they discovered these very powerful begums who were the wives and the mothers and the widows of the Nawabs. And they had sort of come to an understanding with the Nawabs of Awadh of a system that was almost co-sovereignty. So they were ruling their state in a parallel capital of Faizabad, today next to Ayodhya, and the Nawabs were in Lucknow, nearby, companionable, getting along, each ruling their own estates along the sort of mores that they wanted to transfer. So the Begums were following the Mughal fashion and style, for example, so their clothes were far more sober, and they, grumbled against the very fast-paced Lucknow lifestyle. Lucknow, meanwhile, was creating this effervescent culture. The women were wearing far more tight clothes, emulating the courtesan, and the colors were becoming more gaudy, apparently. So you see, they were able to coexist in this system in India. They had found some kind of consensus, which was allowed. When Governor General Warren Hastings came into direct confrontation with one of the Begums, he was horrified. And he wrote back to his home office saying, how dare a woman and a woman in Parda in India, in a country which does not allow its women any freedoms, dare to ask me that she wishes to rule her own country. So you see, once again, the British came with their very patriarchal notions because at the same time in England, women had no sort of financial independence. Elite women did not have the kind of financial independence some of the elite Indian women had. So they brought in their ideas of patriarchy and eventually ended up, at the end of Bahu Begum's very long life, she did finally have to relinquish her wealth to them. So it's interesting to see how the intersection of colonialism and patriarchy somehow plays out in these stories.
I think that we do need multiple histories, and I think it enriches history as a subject because, again, since you spoke about positionality right at the start, where you sit determines how you're looking at a certain subject. You take even historically, right? You and I both come from Maharashtra, and this is an example I often give. There was something in the early 19th century called the Battle of Bhima Koregaon, in which the army of the Peshwa, or the leader of the Marathas, was defeated by the army of the East India Company. If you view that event from a nationalistic lens, it is the defeat of a brown native army at the hands of a colonizing white man's army. But what happens is the British side also has a substantial number of Dalits that are part of the army. So, from the Dalit community's perspective, it is a victory of the Dalit community over a Brahmin ruler and a rather casteist Brahmin ruler and his army. Now, both these perspectives are valid. You can't claim that one is more valid than the other. Nationalistically, yes, if you're thinking of us as the brown man against the white, then yes, it is true that this was a brown army defeated by the white man's army, and it's a story of loss. But within the country, if you look at our caste dynamics, it's actually a story of victory. It is, I mean, that's how it's been positioned by that community, and they draw meaning from it. The historian's job, therefore, is to try and understand both of these perspectives. Even if you look at historical material, it isn't as if we get one standard account. We're in Kerala, and again, this is an example I give of this king called Marthandarma in the 18th century. He was a violent figure. Early 18th century, comes out, becomes a warrior king, conquers all of these states, etc. If you read the official Darbar histories of the Travancore state, it shows that, at one point the claim is that, oh, this was all chaos and he was just uniting his kingdom and consolidating it. At another point, they say it was nationalism because he was afraid that the foreign Dutch and the British would come and take over Kerala, and in order to sort of push a nationalistic project, he saved Kerala from colonization and by uniting all of these southern kingdoms. But if you look at Marthandarma's own time, we have two accounts. One is a Sanskrit account called the Bala Martanda Vijaya, in which the king doesn't want to conquer anything. He's all ready to become an ascetic, etc. And then God appears before him and says, you must now conquer all these kingdoms in order to renovate my temple. So he conquers kingdoms and spills blood because he wants to serve God. That's the justification in Sanskrit. At the same time, in Kanyakumari district, there's a Villapata of the Nadar community in which the same king is a villain. He's a treacherous figure. He's cunning. He's not actually brave. He runs away from battle. That's the kind of presentation of Martanda Varma we get from this counter narrative of a marginalized group. So already in the evidence, we are seeing that there are different versions of the same event that are there. And that doesn't necessarily mean contradiction. It simply means that our job is to understand these multiple perspectives and try and make sense of it from all angles. So in that sense, even when we write history in the present, we do need multiple histories and we do need multiple voices. Ira touched upon this. The fact is that it's not just Mughal or women in history that have been marginalized. It's also that most of the histories have been written by men. So the very act of women now writing history in greater numbers allows women to tease out elements that male historians 100 years ago might have missed, because they fundamentally couldn't see that the female gaze had any value. Whereas today we know that that is not the case. And you therefore need not only stories of more women, you need more women to also tell those stories, including stories like in a book on Akbar. It's a male figure, it's a world of kings and battles and empire building, but again written from her perspective as a female writer, which is again not to box people as, oh, female writer, male writer, but I think it helps us look at the record and see most of its richness in a way that we would miss if there was only one standard history or only one necessarily correct form of history.
When I was growing up, about 80% of the class in which I sat in school thought of history as some strange imposition that other people had decided that we should do. And it was all about just mugging up like 6 causes, 6 consequences, seven states that were, or 2 states that were on Axis powers, 2 that were, and a friend of mine would say things like, "Arey, they only asked for 2 states, yeah, right? Germany, Italy, they were always there, somewhere or the other. You have 50% chance of getting it correct." And suddenly today, history has become like this vibrant, energetic, kind of polarizing thing where discussions are so heated that even in the press club, people can stand up and shout at each other and almost come to blows, which I think is fascinating. But when you've sent out a book into the world and you discover that it has been weaponized, for various narratives, what is your response to that? When people say, for instance, Pierre says, and then quote something out of context that, here it is. The historian has spoken.
You mean when is it working or not? Okay. Thank you. You mean what is our response to the weaponization of our work? I mean, that's very complicated. I mean, we have developed one answer, especially in France. This answer is the public history. Public history. I don't know if it's popular in India, but the idea is that historians, I mean professional historians, have to intervene in the public debate through the different media and not only through books, because we have to be honest, most of our books are only read by several, maximum thousands people, maximum. We published in 2017 a book in France who was a great bestseller. It was the Histoire mondiale de la France, France in the World. It was translated in English. It was 300,000 copies. It was just extraordinary. But on average, a book in social sciences or history sells 300 copies in France. So if you want to be heard, you have to do something else. You have to go outside of the universities, and I chose to adapt my knowledge, I mean our collective knowledge, under the form of, for instance, TV documentary series. I wrote 2 TV series for the European channel Arte, which is an amazing channel in Europe, which produce a lot of documentaries. And I made one of these documentary on the history of colonization and decolonization. And I'm very proud of that because we met a general audience of around 5 million people. Okay, that's very different compared to the 350 copies. And I began this first series by the Lakshmi Bai, the figure of Rani of Jhansi, and I began, hello. The figure of Rani of Jhansi and of course, the Sepoy revolt of 1858. And it was very interesting to follow several very famous in India figures, but unknown figures in France. I mean, except Gandhi, nobody knows Ambedkar. So I talk about Ambedkar, and we know the French discovered Ambedkar. I talk about Sarojini Naidu. Nobody knows Sarojini Naidu, but she's a star in London, for instance, I went to King's College, and she's an alumni, and she's very well known poet, and of course state woman. So TV series is a way to do. Festival is amazing. This festival is amazing, but we have a lot of history festival in France, and it's a unique way of connecting people and to promote not only, it's not the idea to diffuse a diffusionist way of thinking knowledge, for instance, from me to you. No, it's a new space to exchange and to promote a collective reflexivity. That's, very original.
Pierre, I was just thinking when that drone passed and you waved to it, that seems to be like an image of the historian also, no? Like floating on top of everything and trying to get a perspective and a view and seeing where it is. Ira, you've written about the Nawabs just now, and in the current context of our world, the Muslim has been kind of demonized repeatedly. When you chose to write about Lucknow and that particular moment, were there any misgivings in your head about this sort of thing? Because if you are going to be even-handed, then there's going to be stuff there that's not going to read well, to our ears.
Yes, Jerry, thank you for that. Of course, that's always a concern. But what I really tend to find and what I feel we should be talking more about is the huge history of the plunder through the colonial powers, through the British. And that is what I discovered when I looked at the history of the Nawabs of Awadh. Instead, what I've, since we have been given our history to a great degree by the British, who were the eventual victors of that interaction, we have been told consistently that the Nawabs of Awadh were decadent, they were luxury loving, they spent their time in arts and music, they didn't put up any fight, and they sort of gave in to a far superior European power who had the intellectual prowess to give them the railways eventually, And that is a really deep rooted idea that I find we don't fight back against. The kind of plunder, the kind of desecration, destruction of everything at all levels, even manuscripts, books, so much of our intellectual historiography was lost. So we don't know the history of our intellectual pursuits, our scientific pursuits. It's very, very, extremely destructive, in the way in which they interacted with a number of areas, including Awadh. In fact, I find that the areas which have been most destroyed, like Delhi and Awadh, it's because they put up the greatest resistance. So that's what surprised me. And if there's anything to be, talked about, it's really how vibrant that society was, how they were ruling their country with a great deal of diplomacy, foresight, creativity, how they had created a space where people, according to Fanny Parks, the 19th century traveler, she says, the people of Awadh were far happier and sleeker a race than those under the British rule. So this is incontrovertible, and yet we sort of still produce beautiful films like Shatranj Ke Khiladi, which are beautiful, but they are sort of an opiate, which sort of, just cradles us in this idea of beauty and elegance and music and dance, whereas the Nawabs and the Begums fought with such fiery resistance to the idea of the loss of their country. They came up with such, amazingly ingenious solutions to fight that all along each year as the incursions, as the American War of Independence started shaping up, and that's what caused so much of the trouble in India. Again, we've forgotten that. At each stage, the Begums and the Nawabs resisted and found ways to counter that. They kept it at bay as long as they could. So I think that is really what we should be excited about. That is what we should be talking about, Muslim or Hindu. It is the country which has been written about in a certain way and which we need to fix.
Manu, your book has missionaries, in the title, and already that brings religion into the sphere of history. And of course, incontrovertibly, religion has been one of the biggest drivers of history, whether it's been evangelical zeal or just the horror of, other forms of worship. What were your thoughts about this at this point in time?
I think a degree of weaponization is something that is inevitable at some point, because political parties, different groups, they mine history precisely to weaponize it in order to give shape to something they want to achieve or something they want to communicate. But I think to generally get a general audience to understand history better, one way to fight that kind of weaponization is to break down simplistic binaries, to understand that historical figures are weird and complicated, that they don't necessarily fit boxes, just as we don't necessarily fit boxes. We've got all these individual quirks and peculiarities. Historical figures also had their quirks and peculiarities. In India, again, Tipu Sultan is a very, very potent topic, right? In Karnataka, some want to celebrate his birthday as a Jayanti. Others will oppose it, saying that, no, how can you celebrate Tipu's Jayanti? He was anti-Hindu, he slaughtered lots of people, la la la. But the others will say, no, but he fought the British, therefore he is a hero. But the thing is, as I often say, it's not an either-or situation. In history, it's always an and. You can find the same historical figure behaving in one context in, say, a brutal, violent way, because they were kings. Kings were brutal and violent. That's just how they all were. In another context, that same person may seem like he's a poet and have like these soft qualities that we admire, and he seems like a completely different person. In one place, he's a conqueror and he's using religious language to justify his conquest. In another place, he's behaving in a way that seems more syncretic, as if he's tolerant of religion, etc. Because again, it is not a binary. And the way to fight that kind of weaponization is to convince people that these binaries are what put these things into boxes, as opposed to breaking those boxes and trying to look at the full fabric, the full tissue of history in its own right. even now, just the other day on Twitter, I was reading about all the people arguing about Subhash Chandra Bose because the Prime Minister tweeted something about Subhash Chandra Bose for his birthday. A bunch of people in America and the UK, latched onto this saying, "Oh, this is anti-UK because Bose allied he met Hitler, he allied with the Japanese, and he was on the wrong side of history." And again, he was a complicated figure. His goal was to achieve independence for India. If that required going to your enemy's enemy, he was happy to do it. At the same time, does it raise moral questions about allying with a fascist power or a Nazi power? It does raise questions. But again, that does not somehow reduce Bose in any way. We have to be able to understand the full circle instead of cutting it into 5 pieces and trying to only make sense of the pieces that sit well with us. So I think even with the reference on missionaries and stuff, when I put that into the title, to be honest, there was some self-censorship creeping up, which is that, oh, what if people misunderstand this? What if they use it a certain way? But I've realized increasingly from settings like this that the vast majority of people who are engaging with history actually do understand that it is layered and complex and not simplistic. But there is always a vocal minority that's particularly shrill on social media, which makes you feel that you're under siege and that there is only these binary ways of reading history. So then I was like, why am I thinking of that crowd when I'm doing my research? I should think of the silent majority that is actually consuming history in the right perspective with the kind of maturity that is required and write for that audience. Eventually that audience will grow and most people understand it. So I think it's just a question of, figuring out that we just need to be steadfast, and I think the world will slowly, come out the right way.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question that is going to be a bit silly, but I'm not a historian, so what do I care, right? I'm not getting a PhD anyway. Can a historian have a hero? Can a historian have a hero? Like a...
As a citizen, I think you can have hero, but it's difficult to have hero as a historian or as a social scientist, because the idea, as a social scientist, it's difficult to have a hero because your main goal is to denaturalize heroism. Denaturalize this very idea of heroism. So once I have said that, I can say that I'm very interested in pioneering figures. Like we have talked about the national narrative and the universal history, and we talk a little bit also about global history. Global history is that thing to do nowadays, transnational history, new imperial history, etc., etc. And when you're talking about hero, I think that there are forgotten intellectuals who pioneered, who introduced new way of writing history and new way of writing global history. And what is interesting is that global history is usually presented as very recent and very Western invention. But that's not the case. In fact, global history was also invented by Asian intellectuals. And first thing first, perhaps you can remember the example of Nguyen Ai Quoc. And Nguyen Ai Quoc, who is Nguyen Ai Quoc? It's the most famous Vietnamese of the 20th century. It's Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, the founding father of Vietnam, wrote a very important text on global history in 1924. Just to quote Ho Chi Minh, he proposed, in fact, the first critique of the Eurocentric way of writing history. So Ho Chi Minh wrote, in 1924, I quote him, Marx is talking about Marxism, okay? He's talking about Marxism, and he wrote, Marx built his doctrine on a certain philosophy of history. But which history? The history of Europe. But what is Europe? It is not all of humanity. So you can see that exactly 1 century ago, Ho Chi Minh proposed one very strong critique of Eurocentrism. And just another example in India this time. Global historians in North America and in Europe ignore the existence of one of the first global history essay written by a very famous Indian intellectual, Jawaharlal Nehru. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote Glimpses of World History. At the very beginning of the 1930s, he was in prison. And he wrote letters to his daughter, Indira. And he proposed a very radical decentering of history, focusing on the history of kingdoms, of empire, of Asia, especially. So we have to, you were talking about hero. This is a form of, heroism.
And for Ira, of course, I will say, can a historian have a heroine?
So, Jerry, I have written an entire book on the idea of heroines and what it means to be heroic and how we classify our women heroes and how heroism is really has been so for a long time gendered. So it is, if you die on the battlefield, if you are a martial woman, if you're able to accomplish certain things. Whereas, frankly, in my thinking, any woman who manages to leave some record of herself in her life is heroic. Anybody who leaves a poem.
Which is something to all the women. Make notes about your future memoir. Become a heroine.
Exactly right, So,
Ira, you too.
So anybody who is able to, leave a poem, invent a recipe, like Noor Jahan's mother did, for Ittar of Roses, any of these women who managed to enter the record in some way is heroic. So for me, I have a big space in my heart for all these women. Another interesting thing is that sometimes you come to these women, in sideways. So for example, Harka Bai, who was Akbar's first Rajput wife, we think we know her famously through Bollywood as Jodha Akbar, but actually Jodha did not exist. And to come back to Manu's earlier point, how people, have this emotional connection to their historical figures. People were very angry with me when I would say in talks that there was no Jodha in Jodha Akbar. It was a different princess, a different region. So that is something that was they were hanging on to. But the real princess, the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how Akbar actually came to be the great heroic Mughal Pasha that we remember him to this day. I think he owes a great debt to his first Rajput wife because she introduced him to Rajput culture, to Hindu culture, to the need to be very open towards Hindu society, culture, religious mores. So she is one of the great unsung heroes, I think, also of our time. Still today, her influence is seen. So yes, I think any woman who I manage to stumble upon in some way is heroic.
I think what Pierre said at the beginning is how you do your history, which is that you don't go in thinking that, oh, this is a hero and this is how I'm going to write about it. You're supposed to be completely even-handed. So you're going to, that sort of gives you a more of an objective lens. But as I said earlier, historians are also human beings. So we also have that emotional pull. So sometimes if you're researching historical figures and characters, there are definitely some that are more appealing and others that are less appealing. I am always transfixed by these characters who led interesting lives, naughty lives, mischievous things that they did, because it again humanizes them in a way that you don't necessarily get in that stereotypical version of history. So I wouldn't call them heroes. I don't look up to them as heroes, but I do feel some sense of connection to the past by looking at certain figures who sort of, represent the kind of things I value in the present. So I think there's a bifurcation there in terms of the work we do as historians where you're supposed to not believe in the concept of heroes. But then while you do the work, emotionally sometimes you can also sympathize with certain figures more. You can understand certain figures more and you can connect with a lot of them better because you feel more personally for some.
There are about 12 minutes left. It's time for audience questions. I'm sure you have lots of questions. Please keep your question brief because other people also want to ask and want to be heard. Thank you.
Hi, my question is, in what ways can historians, educators, and policymakers can collaborate to challenge and overcome historical polarization?
I'll ask one person to answer that. Manu, would you take that?
I think just by talking to each other. The thing is, often what happens is that a lot of this work exists in silos. It's not as if policymakers who are determining public policy are reading very much history. They're reading whatever public policy textbooks there are. At the same time, historians can also be like frogs in a well, where you're only exposed to your peers, you're only exposed to other historians, and you forget that there's a wider world around you, a world of culture and politics, etc. Whereas Pierre was saying, the historian does need to engage. The historian has to get out of the university hall and also, as much as possible, address a larger audience. So I think sometimes just creating those connections help. There, I think in today's world, the internet is also a good force because it allows you to engage with things or people who work in other fields to understand their perspective. And that's why a lot of the best research done now is intersectional. It is now bringing together not just one purist form of history, but even in the evidence, there's oral history, material history, art, written archives, non-written material, all of that together. Similarly, you've got a sociological perspective. You're thinking of history from a geographical lens, saying how did geography affect history? You're thinking of the environment and how that affects history. So you're bringing together different dots that earlier you would have missed. So I think just being in communication as much as possible helps.
Question on the front.
Hi, this question maybe Manu can answer again. My name is Indira. I've read your books. Yeah, this
Question.
is. Sorry. I'm a great fan of you, Manu. We've actually always hear history is written by Victor. I know it's an old saying. I'm dating myself. Does it ever occur to you when you write history? Because I've read your Ivory Throne and your first book, and I've heard about the controversial book, which I've not read. And I've read two other books of yours. One is not exactly history, but it can be question to any of you. But I like to ask you.
May I ask Ira to answer that one? Okay. History by the victors.
Yes, I think, certainly in the work I've done, this is an evidence. It has been written by the victors. Not only is it written by the victors, but the victors destroy other recordings. That is the way of the victors. Certainly in the 18th century, the notions we have to this day, that the Mughal Empire was simply crumbling and India was in a state of complete, lassitude. And the Europeans were just poised to make a big change with their ideas of the Enlightenment and all of that. That's all been written down quite consciously. You have written records where the governor generals are writing back to their home office saying, we can use the threat of an Afghan invasion to kind of invade Mysore, for example. So these are things that have been written down, that have come to us through the colonial recordings because they kept such fantastic records and written manuscripts. So I think there's the colonial recording, and there's also the lack of other recordings, other sources. So you have to fill in the lacunae in some sense. You have to fill in that gaping hole in other ways, using other sources, other ways of interpreting the past.
Question at the back there. Could you please stand up and ask your question? It helps. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Well, you said even not only women historians, even young male historians like you have pointed out strong women personalities in history like Sethu Lakshmi Bai in Ivory Throne. When everyone talks about Ravi Verma or Martanda Verma, you spoke about Sethu Lakshmi Bai and her legacy as well. But when I speak to most of the people in Kerala or in Trivandrum, most of them haven't heard of her, or even her legacy is not even like so much she has done for the Cochin Harbour and other Viking struggle. But why is that some historic personalities are celebrated and like she has a legacy, but nothing has been spoken about her? And my second question is, you spoke about Viking struggle in your
Question, please. Thank you.
One question.
One
We're
question.
running out of time.
Yeah.
But quickly to answer the question, it's linked to what Ira was saying, which is that because history is written by a type of person, it's often written, at one point it was written only by male historians, there was fundamentally a difficulty understanding that the role of a woman was anything but a footnote, anything but a minor role. So I think a lot of that conditioning exists even now. There's also a degree of unwillingness to accept the space that this woman created for herself in the historical record, because it also poses lots of questions people don't want to ask. For example, in her time in the 1920s, it was a very Nair, upper caste, Hindu-dominated Travancore. And she is supposed to have promoted Syrian Christians and Iravas, for example. And that upset political dynamics in the region, which meant that when the histories were written, again by the dominant groups, what she achieved was sort of played down because she had backed unfashionable or parts of society that people were not keen to allow them to come up. So it's a bit of a mix of that. But yeah, hopefully after reading my book, people will talk more about Setu Lakshmi.
Okay. There's a question over here. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, my question.
Just a moment, sir. We'll come to you.
My question related to the Mughal. When Mughal were ruling, India contributed 27% of world GDP. But when it comes to politics, today's politics, Mughal became a villain. Like as a historian, so how do you, like for example, when they, today the politics played in the name of Mughal, like their expense. So as an historian, what you can do in order to...
Thank you so much. We got the question. Pierre, would you answer that? The question was when, at a certain point, a ruler may be seen as a hero, and then suddenly when the winds of politics change, the same hero becomes a villain. How does the historian negotiate that change?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question. So in fact, in history, this is not the past which determines the present. Okay, intuitively you can think that the past determines the present. In fact, this is vice versa. This is the present that determines the past. That means that each present asks different questions to the past. Each present asks new questions to the past. And this is how the historiography is building up constantly, is enriched by new themes, by new questions, by new issues. For instance, now we are working on the history of environment, on the history of gender, on the history of animals, new questions. On the same subject, we are still working on the Mughal Empire, but with different views on that, okay? New questions. So of course, the political context changed as well, but what is important... yeah.
Thank you. Here we go. Short question, sir.
Yeah. Sir, one important, amazing point I could note is that, see, after seeing many volumes of history text, I could not believe that such a young man has produced all these things. How come you could, sir? I think you have access to all the
Thank you so much.
valuable
Thank
resources.
you. Ma'am, you have a question?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
So
we don't have time. We have 5 minutes.
The basic point is that he is a Pillai. That means he comes the fourth varna. It's the Shudra. Shudra in Sanskrit means slave.
Thank you very
or
much,
bastard.
sir.
So you being the victim of Brahminism, see how do you observe the Brahmin monopoly? How this microscopic parasitic community
We got the question, sir. Thank you.
How they manipulated history.
No, so
please go through your observation.
I wouldn't blame it just on Brahminical society. I mean, the Pillais were also an upper caste community who controlled land and resources. So we've oppressed plenty of people in turn. So there's no escaping the fact that that legacy, which was not always a good legacy, also weighs down on our shoulders. What you can do is be aware of where you're coming in the social hierarchy, be aware of your own past, and be conscious of that when you're doing your writing. For example, in my third book, there is a lot of highlighting of marginalized figures, with not just on the gender axis, but also on the level of caste. Because that's the only way you can correct it. I'm not an activist, but through my writing, I can perhaps highlight elements of caste and be aware of the fact that, yes, the name that I bear does come with something that is unsavory to a lot of people.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hi. I wonder if, just to allude to something that came up earlier, I wonder if as history becomes more popular and as historians become more popular and accessible to the larger population, whether there will be similar issues that historians face as journalists do today, which is that there's a chilling effect based on fear created by the state or by non-state actors. Do you think historians will have to face similar challenges?
Ira? The challenge, as historians become more popular and more accessible, they will also become more vulnerable perhaps to attack as journalists do. Is there a chilling effect on historians with that realization?
See, I think, yes, to some extent, possibly, but I think historians, the sort of writing we do is different from journalism in one sense, in that we take 3, 4, 5 years to write a book. It's not every day or every week that we have pieces, out there that will sort of garner a great deal of traction in terms of, people trying to access you and, give very negative feedback. It's once in a way, once in a few years, you're out there suddenly. Both of us, I think after a few years, we have books so suddenly out in all these public spaces. So it isn't the constant scrutiny that a journalist, it's much harder, I think, and much more dangerous to be a journalist today in India, We do have a little bit of distance as writers of history, even if certainly people like Manu are extremely accessible and people relate to him very strongly. But I think as far as I can see, it's been for the positive rather than the negative.
Can I quickly add to that? I think there's also a factor of language, which is that those of us who write history in the English language, and even journalism in the English language, there's still a degree of insulation, there's still a degree of protection. A Gauri Lankesh was shot because she was writing in Kannada. If she'd written the same thing in English, it's likely that she would have been criticized a lot, but perhaps not shot dead. So I think the fact is that when we write in certain languages and certain spaces, we still have the privilege of some protection, which journalists writing in the bhashas don't.
I think the questions from the audience have been better than the questions that I pose. I propose that you all give the audience a big hand. Thank you very much. Kozhikode, you so rocked this session. Now rock yourself by going out, forming a queue and buying a book of history and getting these wonderful people to sign that book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.